We are so pleased and honored to have Professor Steve Scanlan talk to us about Ireland and the local food movement. But before we get to that, I just would like to bring your attention to a few things. First of all, my name is Teresa Moran, and I am the Food Studies faculty leader. And I would like to point out that at the back of the room, we have a number of flyers for you to inform you of upcoming events. And we also have a list of food studies themed courses for the fall, since we're starting registration. If you'd like to have advising, if you'd like to take one of those, please do. We also have a flyer about a very special course in the food studies theme, a French gastronomy course taught by Dominique Dubert, right there in the back. Yay, yay. So you please afterwards feel free to talk to Professor Dubert about this course if you're interested in it. Then we have a flyer. We've got lots of pieces of paper. We have a flyer about our next event, which is Sandor Katz is coming. We're bringing him on April 2nd, and that will be at 5:30 in Baker Theater, and we're expecting a very large crowd. So please mark your calendars and come to that event. It is, of course, free and open to the public. And then the last flyer that we have there is information about the food studies themed summer courses. This is a new launch this summer, and there's Professor Art Tracy here, who is heading up the seminar on how food works in the community, which is a seminar and internship opportunity to work with local food production, local food nonprofits, and other entities in our local food system. So please feel free to talk to Dr. Tracy or myself about this summer course. Talk to Dr. Dubert about French gastronomy, and of course, talk to Dr. Scanlan about Irish food. And to get us started, we're going to have the Chair of Sociology and Anthropology, Dr. Chris Matley, is going to introduce our speaker.
Happy St. Patty's Day. It's really a tremendous pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Steve Scanlan. In thinking about what to say about Steve, I realized there's a lot I can say. So rather than making you listen to me forever, I'll do the brief version and we can get to what he's going to talk about. A little bio. Steve received his PhD from the Ohio State University in 2000, and then took a position at the University of Memphis. We were able to steal him away in 2006. He joined us, and I happen to think it was a pretty good steal. He's an award-winning teacher. Among his accolades, he currently holds the Eric Wagner Teaching Professorship. And like all good teachers and researchers, I think his research and his teaching are combined. His areas kind of overlap. So this relationship between his teaching and his research, I think, is a really strong one. He teaches courses on, I don't know if I should list them all, on inequality, poverty, social movements, collective behavior, and globalization. He's a prodigious and well-respected scholar, and he focuses on, not surprisingly, poverty, inequality, social movements, development and social change. And he received a Fulbright award and was in National University of Ireland in Galway. I always kind of want to split a couple of those. But he was there in fall of 2013. While he was there, he conducted research on development, inequality, social change, and he focused specifically on gender, sustainable development, and the environment. So his talk today is a result of some of that work, and it's entitled, as you can see, Eating Away at Austerity, Ireland and the Local Food Movement. So help me welcome Dr. Scanlan.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Can everyone hear me okay? I know this room's a little funky sometimes. I'm going to kind of be bouncing around. I was hoping there was a clicker over here, but there's not. But so I'll be using the mouse back and forth and trying not to block the the screen, but I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you for coming out on a sunny St. Patrick's Day, which is a rarity in Ohio. I'm used to either wearing snow boots or a very, very, very warm sweater. So I appreciate you spending your time here today and hopefully learning a bit about Irish food, but also telling me what I can do to learn more and engage this topic more and so forth. So just to set the stage a little bit, Chris had mentioned a couple of these things, but first I should probably tell you what I am and what I am not, and Chris set that up. First of all, I'm not an economist. I'm not an agriculture economist even. I'm not a rural sociologist. I'm not a cultural anthropologist, a historian, or a policy expert. Okay, so those of you who want to leave, feel free, because I don't know anything about those things. But what I am is a sociologist interested in the things that Chris mentioned, but also food as part of a central dynamic in society. So I've looked at food movements, I've looked at hunger, things of that nature. And sociology cuts across all those disciplines that I said I'm not a part of. And hopefully I can bring some of those insights into the topic of food movements in Ireland, but also kind of food and culture and food studies more generally. I envision this presentation being a number of things. One, it's partly academic, right? I have to earn my keep, so to speak, and bring in the research dynamic and the elements of this talk that's really part of my overall research foundation here in research program. But at the same time, it's a lot of reflection. It's a lot of reflection on my time in Ireland. It's a lot of reflection on emerging questions in that research program. Therefore, a lot of it is about exploration. And that's hopefully where you all come in. That's hopefully where me doing this generates new ideas and other thoughts that come from this. Because this is the first I've talked about this project to anyone. So it's exciting for me to do that. At the same time, it's a learning process as well. So lastly, then I want it to be both my presentation, but also discussion and questions. This is the Food for Thought series, after all, and hopefully what I talk about will I don't want to go as far as to say inspire thought, but maybe generate an idea or two or some questions in ways that we as an audience and presenter can engage each other in conversation. I'll try to minimize the blarney. Okay, I could go on and on with lots of stories and lots of tangents. If any of you have had me in class, you know I'm perfectly capable of doing that, but I'll try to minimize that. But having said that, though, I do want to start with a bit of blarney. Well, actually, it's not blarney. It is true, but another way of setting the stage, and that is, it goes back to a Fulbright with butternut squash and goat cheese risotto at the Yellow Pepper in Letterkenny, County Donegal. Okay, now what the heck does that mean? Well, as Chris said, I was on a Fulbright in Ireland in 2013 and for the fall semester at NUIG, and I taught a class on international development and inequality. And the Fulbright folks tell you when you go there with your project and do your research. That's why you're there after all. But they also warn you, and they warn you to be open, to be aware that there's going to be things you're going to bump into. There's going to be things that catch your interest that you're going to want to explore more deeply. And I kind of knew that going in. The work I did on gender development and the environment, I probably could have done at any number of places. NUIG had some particularly well-developed programming and faculty in that area, so that was a good choice. But I was also inherently interested in many questions associated with Ireland. Okay, I'd done hunger strike research in the past, and I was curious about certain movements in Ireland, not just food, but they've had protests regarding salmon fisheries. They've had protests regarding pipelines. That sounds familiar, I'm sure, to us here in the United States and so forth. So I went into things open-minded. I went into things expecting to find other explorations and possibilities. Which brings me then to the butternut squash and goat cheese risotto. And my wife and I are at this wonderful restaurant called the Yellow Pepper in Letterkenny, County Donegal, up in the northwest part of the country. And I'm, unlike places here in the United States, we don't often see a lot of television sets in restaurants and pubs and waiting areas. They're there, but they love their television and their soccer or football, and their Gaelic sports and whatnot. But I'm sitting with my back to the one TV, which is probably about 30 or 40 feet away, and my wife kind of stops and looks up and aghast, and the Ohio University logo is pasted on the TV in front. And I thought, what? You're kidding. And I turned and I missed it and whatnot. But essentially, the restaurant we were at in County Donegal was a key site in the production, the writing, and the direction of a wonderful film that some of you may be familiar with. If you're not, I highly recommend, called Made in Donegal. Is anybody familiar? Anybody be a part of that? Okay, well, there happens to be a wonderful script writing, film production, international studies program carried on by the Scripps School that produced a wonderful 20-minute documentary on food in Donegal that is a great way of capturing what the food system means to the Irish people and what it means with regard to economic well-being, what it means with regard to moving forward as an economy. And there are a lot of parallels there, here, and those things will come up as well. And I thought, how odd that I go, a third of the way around the world, try to have a nice dinner, and I can't get away from Ohio University. But that was a good thing, right? That's a good thing in a sense that after talking with the owner and manager owner of the restaurant, and she spoke highly of Ohio University, but more importantly spoke highly about the significance of the restaurant, the farm that they own that supplies the restaurant, the wonderful people they have coming to the restaurant that really enjoy great food, but ultimately the fact that they can make a wonderful living doing the things they love based on what Ireland as a country has to offer with regard to food. So I highly recommend the film. So moving forward then, just a couple things just regard to the outline. A bit on Irish food and what I mean by local, and that's a moving target. It's not definitive, but definitely there's some ideas. Got to put this in the economic context of Ireland, its collapse and return, so to speak. Tie that then to the core of the title, the eating away at austerity, and how food in Ireland has played a part in that. Some say big, some say small, some others say somewhere in between, but an important part nonetheless. Lastly then, I'll set up some ensuing debates, local food movements, and food nationalism ideas, as well as challenges of authenticity and co-optation, which of course are always interesting when it comes to things that work and who's allowed to capitalize and benefit from those. Okay, so first things first. I had lots of fun doing this, and my goal is to make you all hungry by the time the talk is over. But we can ask ourselves, what are Irish foods? What are local Irish foods? What are traditional Irish foods? Any way that you want to say it, and I hope these are coming out okay. But we could look at any number of things that might come to mind when people think of Irish food or those who might want to explore Irish food. So we could talk about Galway Bay oysters, or we could talk about Burren smoked salmon. Certainly we have to look at cattle, and dairy cattle especially, milk being the largest meat or largest animal product in the country, with beef following that. We could look at any number of dishes. Okay, we could look at boxty, a nice potato pancake, or some colcannon, a nice either cabbage or kale mixed with mashed potatoes, a wonderful thing. Lots of butter, got to add lots of butter. One of the top producers of butter in the country. Tomatoes, you might not have known, the top agricultural product in Ireland. Okay, you can't have a traditional Irish breakfast without a grilled tomato on the side. Okay, so lots of wonderful things, lots of things to explore. But what about these? What about these? A Barry's tea, a Brennan's home baked product, Kerrygold butter, dairy products. Certainly look at things like Butler's chocolate or Ballygowan water, McGann's Irish oatmeal. Maybe you've seen, maybe you're familiar with some of these products. Okay? Well, these are certainly quote unquote Irish, right? They're Irish how? Well, they're Irish designated. There are criteria defined by certain organizations, Board B of the National Food Board, the Irish other boards promoting Irish food, in a sense that, now I was only there a few months, but I'm pretty darn sure there's not a cocoa plantation in Ireland, okay? Nor are there any tea plantations, right? Don't grow tea in Ireland, you don't grow cocoa, but yet, by some definitions, these are local, these are Irish, okay? Which we scratch and we wonder, okay, wait a minute. You know, we had these things. I'm pretty sure that lamb is Irish, okay? You know, this salmon was just caught off the Atlantic coast. These things are all grown and whatnot. But it begs the question, it gets to the question then, well, how might other things in the grand scheme of the food economy, in the agri-food industry, in the interest of both the corporate aim as well as the government aim, as well as the local food aim, how can other things become Irish, so to speak? So that becomes a key question. You kind of hold on to that idea, especially when we get to the back end, because also there are these, and you being US citizens, I'm sure you probably recognize every one of those, right? Probably recognize Knorr and Nestle and Kraft and Uncle Ben and Mars and so forth and Heinz, right? Well, interestingly enough, there are food promotion websites, there are food promotion agencies in Ireland that will lump these in as well because, say, Heinz might partner with an Irish company, right? Knorr or Campbell's or Nestle or Kraft might partner and might attach themselves and create products that are seemingly Irish, but yet there's a global interest in that as well, okay? Which brings us then to the question, well, local foods is kind of a messy kind of thing. We don't often have a clear definition, and there's much discussion and debate. There are many controversies, there are many ways of trying to figure that out. One perspective is certainly the kind of like what we might have here in Athens, right? We have a farmer, foodie, small shop perspective. It's local. We know the 30-mile meal program, right? That in Athens might be this kind of designation, where we know the farmer, we know the product, we know how it was produced, we know its food miles and where it came from. This, on the other hand, contrasts with a more corporate or more state-centered approach. That is, companies, larger corporations that are in the food business for the sole purpose of big markets, selling not only small shop, but big grocery store, and even export being a big part of that, okay? So small shop versus corporate is one way of haggling over what local is. But with any food studies topic, we also have to bring in cultural, we have to bring in economic, we have to bring in kind of traditional considerations. And by that, what do I mean? Well, let's look to the past. What have people eaten? What foundations with regard to food has this society built itself on? What is the history of food? What are the cultural connections to food in the economy? And how are those localized? And so that's where it comes back to a lot of times with regard to what people are consuming, what people are growing, what people are selling and marketing. It comes back to generation after generation after generation of doing so. And that makes it traditional, that makes it local, that makes it something that they own. On the other hand, though, we might swing back and we might say, well, how is it produced? Is it produced on a large scale? Is it big farming, large acreage? There's not a lot of that in Ireland. The average farm size in Ireland is 80 acres compared to 435, give or take, here in the United States. Also must consider, how is it marketed? Am I producing this cream to be sold within the country, within 100 miles of where I'm milking my cows? Or is this being exported to Europe, the European Union? Is this being exported, to Great Britain? So marketing schemes and who you plan to share it with. And then, of course, there's also change in evolving tastes, right? So Ireland, in terms of food, has experienced a large resurgence in getting back to its roots, but fancying it up a bit. Fancying it up and embracing salmon in a way that maybe your ancestors didn't. Okay, so there's a foodie culture that's emerging that some folks who are this generation might say, well, this is Irish food, whereas their parents or grandparents might have said something much, much differently. Okay? Well, on the corporate lineage, there are a lot of reasons and there are a lot of ways that Irish food is defined local, or Irish food is defined for what it is from the top down. Okay? From the top down. So the Irish food sector, the government itself, has done a lot to make various official designations of what Irish food is. Various quality assurance programs. So from Board Via, the Irish Food Board, will say, hey, this is our seal. This is purely, strictly, genuinely Irish food, and we want to make sure that you know that. And there's also ties to sustainability now as well. So Origin Green is a new program from Board Via that ties in not just local food, that ties in traditional food, but has the sustainability, the environmental well-being emphasis. Another huge way, the tourism industry has really, really hopped on board the Irish food interest that's taken place, the meaning of local food, the cultural dynamics of local food. You can't go to any of the travel websites, Ireland.com or visitireland.com or .org, FaltaIreland.com. I mean, any of them, they have a whole food section that you can explore. And they're going to emphasize certainly the heritage, but they have food calendars on there. They'll have food trails. They'll have food festivals as being a central element of why you should visit Ireland. Okay? Felt that Ireland will even do programming for you as a business owner, for you as a farm owner, for you as a cheese shop owner, to help you promote the quote-unquote place on a plate. Place on a plate. A key idea with regard to defining what Irish food is, making it a local niche, and at the same time making that attractive to outsiders who might ultimately want to take part in that. Okay, on a more micro level, on a more focused level, we could also look to official designations. We could look at European Union's designation of origin, or its protected geographical indicator, its POD and its PDO and its PGI. And these are those indicators that a company or a product, or a country or a product can claim that gives it an official designation and says this product is from this area or mostly from this area, and anybody else can't call it as such. So we've heard like champagne, for example. You can't have champagne unless it's from that region of France. You can't have truly Parmigiano Reggiano cheese unless you're from that portion of Italy. Well, Ireland has a few of those, and they're probably not as householdy of a name as Greek feta or Parmesan cheese. So Clare Island salmon, Connemara Hill lamb, Immokalee regato, Oriel sea salt hasn't been approved yet, but it's probably will be soon. Waterford Blah and Timmerlig brown pudding. And actually I'm kind of glad that the brown pudding image is dark enough because, well, that was literally the only image I could find online, and it's not a very attractive one. Blood pudding is probably not an attractive thing to begin with, but it's an Irish product and they can claim those origins. However, because so few foods have that designation, it doesn't help us to restrict local to being those things. Okay? Extending this dynamic, the idea of local foods, the idea of marketing tourism based on the food industry, the idea of expanding your exports, all has to do with the fact that the Irish economy experienced both kind of a boom and bust. Actually, probably in the lifetime of the students that are in here. So this is your life in a nutshell. Essentially, the Irish economy was experiencing enormous growth, 1990s to the mid to late 2000s. Especially during 1995 to 2000, it grew so rapidly that it was dubbed the Celtic Tiger. Okay, it outpaced growth in the European Union, outpaced growth globally, in a sense that because of the tech industry, because of the pharmaceutical industry, because of great investment from outside the country's borders, in addition to housing and real estate expansion in the financial sector, the Irish people were living like they never had before. Disposable incomes were on the rise. Investing was on the rise, and it was unreal. But of course, like all good things, eventually these come to an end, and the global economic downturn in 2008 really hit Ireland hard, okay? Led to the economic collapse and crisis, which involved numerous things that if we had a couple more hours, we could probably get into more, but we'll get to the response, the return here. But certainly a banking bailout and scandal, enormous debt, external debt, but also debt from people buying real estate, people from investing that wasn't necessarily as profitable as they assumed. The real estate markets bubble burst. Projects literally stopped, with foundations poured and nothing else. And then high unemployment and high out-migration. Migration, out-migration, emigration is certainly something that the Irish people have a history of. And now Irish youth, by youth 18 to 25-year-olds, are leaving Ireland at a rate now never before seen for decades, if not centuries, because of the collapse. So it hit Ireland hard, and it led to severe externally imposed austerity measures. So in November 2010, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, as conditions of a $92.9 billion, I didn't put the billion there, but trust me, it's not $92.9. $92.9 billion lifeline had to reevaluate its economy and had to think ahead about how to recover. So just briefly, I have a few of these charts, and I don't want to overwhelm you with these, but you can see the Irish economy during this period. So it went from roughly, this is gross domestic product in billions, 83.6 billion in 1990 to its peak of 232 billion just prior to the collapse. Collapse falls, and it's been relatively stable ever since the last few years. And this goes up to 2014. Okay? Similar pattern. I don't have the numbers on the line. The numbers are too big. But in terms of per capita GDP and constant US dollars, the pattern is pretty much the same as well. Great growth, drop back, stabilization with a slight uptick. Okay, well, the context here that we want to look at is, well, what happened to the food economy? What was the food economy doing during that austerity period, during that collapse period? What's it been like since 2007? And has it helped or hurt? And has that kind of local food dynamic been a part of the recovery? Okay, well, it comes down to a kind of an interesting approach in the sense that it goes back to people in Ireland realizing what they've always been doing and what they've done well, and that's growing food, harvesting the seed. And there's a wonderful quote from journalists Philip Boucher-Hayes and Suzanne Campbell, who wrote a book on what's happened to Irish food, and that is, quote, "In times where Ireland's wealth and economic stability have taken a battering, a bit of refocus on farming and the food sector is not just a return to our past, but an investment in our future." Okay, wow. You know, that says a lot in a time when Apple, opens up a headquarters in Dublin, at a time when Facebook and Google, right, are opening up headquarters and shops in Dublin, a time when foreign investment is buying real estate and investing in the high-tech sector, at a time when pharmaceuticals are one of the biggest exports from the country. We're going to go back to raising cattle. We're going to go back to slaughtering hogs. We're going to go back to growing produce and selling it and processing and marketing it. Now, going back is a bit of an overstatement. They never stopped, but what happened in the austerity period was a realization that, hey, the food sector isn't going anywhere. Those fields aren't going anywhere. Those cattle aren't going anywhere. We as a nation have a commodity here, a commodity industry that is indeed very valuable, and we can use that to recover. We can use that to move forward, and not only move forward, we can kind of reinvent ourselves at the same time. So my dad used to say, everybody's got to eat, right? Everybody's got to eat. So, so no matter what, if you're looking for something where you're always going to have a market, open a grocery store, start a farm, or a funeral home, but that's on the negative side, right? Everybody's got to eat. Well, that's the idea of the recovery from the austerity program. Okay? The food and agriculture sector is somewhat recession-proof, right? Now, we may eat differently. We may eat less if we're unemployed or if we're experiencing setback. But we're going to eat something. We're going to eat something. And at the same time, when others outside the country, where others might be doing better than we are, still are eating, we can have those markets. We can have those opportunities. So in this sense, Ireland's food economy is very resilient. Okay? It's very resilient. It sustained itself through the hard time, but also helped fuel the economic recovery, and it helped empower the country to escape the austerity programs in 2013. That is, it played a key part, a key role in making sure that we maintained ourselves as a country, maintained ourselves as an economy, and were able to escape austerity before colleagues in Portugal, before colleagues in Cyprus, before colleagues in Greece, which of course of late has slipped back into even further difficulties. Okay? How did they do that? Well, they did that with regional and local food networks, combined with state-led efforts and growth in food and agricultural exports. Okay? So just to take a look at that, from the outbreak or the onset of the collapse in 2007 to recovery or post-recovery in 2014 a year, you can see that total value of Irish food and drink exports as a proportion of the GDP took a slight dip, and it's gone up with a slight drop back from 2013 to 2014. Similarly, the total value of ag output as a percentage of GDP, that is how important is agriculture to the economy, 2.9, 3.14, slight dip, rise, and then again another kind of dip back between 2013 and 2014. Now, 4.1% GDP is not a huge thing, right? Okay, it's not 50%, it's not 33%, it's not, but the idea is that from this time there was growth. From this time there was stability and growth. It wasn't harmed. It didn't take the dip like the real estate sector. It didn't take a collapse like the banking and financial sector. It didn't take the hit like the pharmaceuticals and the tech. Agriculture maintained itself. Agriculture moved forward. Agriculture hired people. It exported goods. It survived, so to speak. Relative to employment, relative to merchandise exports, we can see that there was a dip, stable, and an increase of agriculture as a percent of what they were exporting in terms of merchandise. And then in terms of employment, steady, slight drop, steady, and then upgrowth since 2012. So the economy's there. People are being hired. They're exporting goods and services. A couple other things. I won't mention too much about this, but just some of the products. Biggest exports, dairy products, beef, prepared foods are the largest, followed by beverages and any number of smaller items. I can come back to this if you have individual questions. This comes from Board BIA, the National Food Board. But this one's probably one of the more interesting. I'm sorry it's a little fuzzy. I got this from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marines website, and it's a PDF, so it's a little fuzzy. But this is Ireland's degree of self-sufficiency with regard to food. That is, what's the wiggle room? What's the luxury? What's your ability to export? You have a surplus of things, so ship it out, sell it. So butter, 10 times as much butter as you could ever possibly consume, right? Okay. In terms of self-sufficiency, they're above board on pretty much everything except the drinking milk. The drinking milk. They can export sheep and pig and beef and meat. They can export cereals and barley and oats. Wheat, they're a little down, and actually the principal cereals, they're really down. Now, if we know our Irish history, this is export by choice. This is export for profit. This is an export to feed the British royalty. Okay? This is real. This is an extremely important part. And this was central in many ways to the Irish recovery. However, and this is where we get into the food movement type of dynamic and a lot of the debates. However, like all good things, they come with an asterisk. Like all good things, we have to say, okay, but. And that but is what we want to get behind with regard to local food, and whether I'm talking about it from the foodie kind of, I know my farmer, I saw that cow yesterday, it's on my plate today kind of dynamic, versus the more corporate, versus the more state-led, versus the more food system dynamic. Okay? In this sense, then, we have to ask a question, and that is quote-unquote local food in Ireland essentially national? And this is a discussion that we can have. That is, Ireland's about the size of South Carolina. It's smaller area-wise than Ohio. So maybe geography, maybe the country's small size make it easier for the quote-unquote local to become national. If you're in Central Ireland, you can get pretty much anywhere else on the island within 2 or 3 hours, depending on the road and time of day and whatnot. Okay? That's not that far. That's pretty much, that would be a regional economy in the United States. So that can benefit locally in regional economies, but also can become a national thing, right? So therefore, Board BIA, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Management, they can promote traditional Irish foods, okay? Sourcing, they can even think about the philosophy of what it means for local food, while at the same time promote exports. They can promote the Irish economy, promote what it has to offer abroad, okay? To what extent can they do that? And to what extent, then, a big question, though, is can they do that, promote the national, without compromising the local? And that's the key tightrope that you have to walk, okay? And then lastly, on this front, to what extent are the kind of the locavore, the organic, the slow food promoters able to uphold both that pride, that tradition, that culture, these types of things? What Irish food really means to them, and to what extent is that not going to be compromised from national or nationalizing our national interests? Okay? With regard to local food then, a key thing, a key consideration with regard to the local food movement, and this is true in Ireland, it could be true here as well, it comes down to questions of authenticity. It comes down to what's real, what's pure, what's genuine. Is my belief, is my philosophy behind raising these cattle, is my philosophy behind creating this cheese, is my philosophy behind baking this bread, okay? are my blood, sweat, and tears that I put into it or my family put into it being represented the way I would want it represented? Being represented the way my family, generations prior to me, would want it to be represented? That is, to what extent does it really, capture that authenticity, right? When you break the bread, do you hear Irish music, so to speak? Okay? That doesn't really happen, but if you listen, it might. Okay? So authenticity becomes important. The local food movement in Ireland wants to protect that. It wants to promote its many offerings. Certainly, it wants to contribute to the economy. It wants to take the lead in the food industry, but its approach is slightly different. Okay? Yeah, it takes advantage of food tourism. Yeah, it takes advantage of a website that might promote, a certain thing that might get visitors in your cheese shop. But it emphasizes things that we in Athens might be familiar with, right? It emphasizes things like the artisan producers of baked goods, cheeses, oils producers. Certainly culinary instruction, learning the craft, farmers markets, farm stands, farm and sea-to-table programs, food festivals, food tourism, restaurants that are locally sourced, and on and on and on and on. That's what it's about. It's about the in-your-face, this is the food and embrace it kind of idea. It's about the slow food idea of good, clean, and fair, knowing where it comes from, high quality, fairness in terms of the way it's produced, environmentally sustainable, and these types of things. Certainly tied to that, very limited processing, health benefits, knowing where it comes from, knowing why, how, and where it's produced. These are all important emphases. And those can sometimes get in the way of mass production. Those can sometimes get in the way of large-scale production for solely for export, as opposed to solely for the love of food. Okay? So what the local food movement does, therefore, it wants to make sure that Irish food, or traditional Irish food, is not diluted of its meaning. It doesn't lose out on what the ancestors and what the current farmers and their families, what current food producers are working hard to make sure doesn't lose its richness, its cultural richness. Okay? The idea then is to not allow corporate identity, the quote-unquote big, to overshadow the small, the local, the individual. Okay? That network of many that makes the local food movement viable and resilient strengthens the national. It benefits the national. It has a part to play in the national, but it shouldn't lose out to the national. Okay? Last point, and then I want to open up for discussion. The emphases of the local food movement really seem to be taking hold, really seem to be working, really seem to be something that have been embraced in communities, in regions, small towns and villages, fishing villages, as well as by corporations, as well as the state. How do I know? How do we know? Da 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 da. You know the slogan, right? How do we know that something is successful? It potentially gets co-opted, right? It potentially gets co-opted. So when you have that balance, when you have a local and a national, a foodie versus a corporate, if what the foodie folks are doing is working, corporate will eventually do what? It will mimic it. It will pick up on it. And it will say, wow, what a great idea. How can I market that as well? So to close with just a couple examples here of the cautionary tale moving forward and how to maintain that struggle, that balance between local versus national versus corporate, we have the Irish beef program. In Ireland, McDonald's is a strong supporter of Irish beef. Just like in the United States, they've promoted all beef coming from U.S. farms. There's the Irish produce program for McDonald's, although I'm not sure how beef or bacon or eggs or milk or cheese are actually produce. But it's McDonald's, so we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Okay? So McDonald's is only one example. We could go to Supermax as well, which is Ireland's kind of version of McDonald's. Go to their website right now, and the first thing you'll see, 100% fresh Irish chicken. Because local, traditional, backyard chicken from our own neck of the woods is what's best, right? Okay? Go to any of the grocery chains. Aldi Ireland. Aldi's actually a German company. Ireland's the Irish affiliate. They'll have their Irish sourcing program. Okay? Board B approved, right? Board B approved, but a different philosophy potentially. Complementary, ideally, but outcome different. Tesco Ireland, Tesco's a British company. Tesco Ireland's the Irish affiliate. Also has its Tesco Homegrown in Ireland program to emphasize its products. And actually Tesco is good in the sense that they have a regional calendar, they have a what's in season calendar and so forth and so on. Okay, so with that, thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening and taking part in the conversation. And I will happily open up for any questions or comments or critiques or suggestions that you might have. Thanks. I will rest on my green stool. Any clarifications or anything that you want me to? Yes, please. Lisa. Oh, no, yeah, yes, Lisa, go ahead.
The production of the beef and the chicken, is that factory farming?
It's much different. And there's variation, but it's, for the most part, it's regional slaughterhouses, regional, oh, I'm sorry, repeat the question. The question was the farming in terms of the production of say, beef cattle or poultry or hog processing or any of the meats. How is that done? Is that factory farming or is it more localized? And it's kind of well, not more than kind of. It's the opposite of here. There are no CAFOs, okay? No concentrated agriculture feedlots and whatnot. I had this figure, but most of the cattle, the head of cattle that a farmer will have, there's like, again, the McDonald's website, that's 18,000 farmers. I mean, that's a lot of farms for a small place. Meaning that the beef that they're buying is coming from a farm that may have 50, 100, 200 head of cattle, potentially. We're not talking thousands of head of cattle being marched onto trucks, taken to a centralized slaughterhouse. The slaughtering processes are more localized. And simplified, be it for cattle, be it for lambs, be it for chickens. The egg processing is a lot different than egg farms that we see here. The challenge, though, is potentially could it go that route, right? Potentially could the large-scale egg farm that we have here in the States be the norm and be the more acceptable, more profitable way to go? So it's much different. Not completely pristine and idyllic. The Irish agriculture has changed, to mechanization in many ways and larger scale in many ways, but nothing like what we have here in terms of that type of production. Thank you. Yes, Larry.
Some of this, I think, difference in terms of the structure of farming in the EU is because the EU regulates.
Yeah.
They have very
Yeah.
much kind of different kinds of production regulations than we do in the U.S. And as long as that holds, there's going to be quite a difference, I think, in the way the supply chains are structured.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
I think one of the things I see is kind of the same kind of bifurcated food system that exists in the U.S., where you've got the kind of the local food stream, which is pretty much separate from corporate, that kind of agribusiness food stream. And it seems like that's happening in Iowa.
Yeah, definitely. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Burmeister actually is a rural sociologist. So take what he's saying as golden here. And you're absolutely right. Being a member of the EU really plays a really big role, not just in Ireland, but in any of the EU member states, in a sense of things that, just the way, in the manner of how animals are treated, just the way in terms of cleanliness, in terms of the way of truth and labeling. I mean, there's any number of things that makes the food system have a lot more checks along the way that we might take for granted or that we don't have. But yeah, the bifurcating food system, I think the parallel there is what really is interesting. This kind of builds off Lisa's question in the sense that 20 years from now, will that kind of system become more and more in part? Will farmers who might have traditionally sold to, say, local shops or sold from for a local market prefer to sell, say, be one of McDonald's is 18,000 producers, or be a supplier for Tesco Ireland, or be a supplier for Audi and that kind of thing. Have that guaranteed market, which a lot of local folks here have that, they walk that line as well. Geez, do I roll the die and hope people come to the farmer's market, or can I get 25% of what I produce be guaranteed, be purchased by somebody else? So it'll be curious to see where it goes. It'll be and we'll see how that plays out. Yeah.
I was kind of wondering if there's an organic food movement, or I know that GMOs are really restricted in Europe, but
Yeah.
you didn't see anything about organics in any of your slides.
I think I had just the word organic movement in the one slide, but I don't think I mentioned it. And it's emerging. And in fact, just like kind of a locavore movement in Ireland. I mean, Ireland in terms of its food movement, this is kind of a new thing in terms of organics, but also calling themselves a locavore movement, preferring local food as a foodie type. And yeah, there is an emerging small but growing. There have been a couple of studies on that movement. A lot of it is tied to, it goes back, of course, to the production, not just of grains and beef, but also like the salmon that might be farmed, which that's a whole nother realm of debate. But organic farm salmon, so the salmon that I mentioned in terms of having the designation, that's an organic salmon that is produced. Some of the traditional produce is certainly organic. You going to any grocery store or farmer's market, you would not have any trouble finding organic, but it's not quite doesn't have quite the place that it would say here, say in Athens or in some places here in the United States. The other thing, the EU versus USDA designations for organic are a little different, and the EU designations are even more multi-layered and more specific and restrictive in some sense, although in a good way, in terms of making sure that you know what actually is organic versus isn't. And a lot of folks, kind of like here, if you talk to them, they can say, here's how I produce, and here's what I feed my cattle, and here's how I grow my carrots. I'm not certified, I'm not officially EU organic, but I pretty much am, that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of that, especially with a lot of the, if you have a 50-acre farm and whatnot, you might not go through all the steps that the EU requires for you to be officially organic. But there's definitely an awareness. I think the biggest place is probably a lot of the restaurants that directly source their food. So I mentioned the yellow pepper in the outset. That restaurant in Letterkenny, Donegal, it's a restaurant, but they also have their own farm. And so everything they grow, as much as possible, they try to make organic and limited pesticide and herbicide use and no mass production, no mechanization, and so forth. And I think that's where you see a lot of it, because that's attractive, not just to locals, but again, the food tourists, the food tourism industry, people coming from Europe, the United States, Asia. They want to go and they want to know that, wow, this food is not only local, but it's pristine, it's as pure as can be in terms of when it ends up on my plate. So growing, but not quite as huge as we might think. Yeah, please.
I know a large amount of carbon emissions come from the agricultural
Sure.
business. Does this have any implication for Ireland's overall environmental impact?
Certainly. I mean, if you have methane production from, say, beef cattle or dairy cattle, hog farming, those are enormous impacts. In terms of the food chain, we know that animal production has a much larger ecological footprint than, say, harvesting wheat or beans or things lower on the food chain. In terms of Ireland's kind of overall carbon footprint or its ecological footprint, it's like any other or most other European countries, they're consuming, or their footprint is bigger than what they produce, but Ireland's at the lower end of that because of its concentration. I don't know its exact number, but there's definitely that kind of impact. Lower mechanization, though, certainly has benefits, or the reduction in that, as well as the size and the locality and the food miles. So from field to plate is much less. It's not traveling thousands of miles like it is here. Now, granted, Germany's importing food, Spain's importing food. There are places importing Irish food. There are food miles at that end. But Ireland doesn't, its trade deficit in food is, back to that slide with their surplus. It doesn't, the food miles coming in are minimal compared to what they consume. So there's that angle of it. But definitely a footprint. I don't know the exact, but it's something I could look into for sure. Yep. Good, good. The other things. Yes, please.
One of the last things you mentioned was this slide with the surplus, which shows, particularly dairy, an enormous supply. And that's part of one of the EU scandals, because the EU funds
Yeah,
this surplus and
definitely.
pays farmers
Yeah.
to produce and then destroy, which is questionable at all kinds of levels for the taxes that people put in Europe for why do we produce this food in the first place, because it goes unused.
Yeah, the subsidy. I'm glad you mentioned subsidies, because EU subsidies. We often talk about subsidies here in the United States, as being enormous, and this unfair playing field, the bifurcation between big versus small, and EU subsidies are just as have just as big of a hand potentially in agriculture and what's produced and why. And in fact, a big place that you'll see this in Ireland, if you go to the Food and Agriculture Organization's data and its website in terms of who produces what and how much, some of the top products in terms of Ireland's agricultural, not its meat base, but its agriculture economy, are crops for fodder. Enormous amount of fodder crops. So, for example, pumpkins. It's an enormous producer of pumpkins that are in turn pretty much used as fodder for hogs, and a lot of that is subsidized. They wouldn't produce as much as they would of these certain things if it in turn wasn't. And this kind of goes back to your question as well. How are we producing one thing, feeding it to another, until ultimately, we consume it, and there's steps along, as opposed to, grass-fed cattle and letting them eat off the land and things of that nature. But subsidies play a key part in that, and that was part of the bailout too, in terms of the $92.9 billion certainly had ties and connections to what we were going to emphasize, and it wasn't just about lifting up the banks. There were other sectors that gained from that. So. Very important. It's definitely all connected.
Well, Steve, thank you very much for a really fantastic St. Patrick's Day insight into Ireland. And also, I'd like to invite everybody to join Professor Scanlan and the other professors here in the faculty commons for some light refreshment of Irish soda bread and Irish cheese. So thank you again, Steve.